Only mode.
Yes, good morning. My name is Dan Davidson. I work with the Illinois Soybean Association. I want to welcome you to our webinar this morning. Our speaker is Fred Bushel, an agronomist at the University of Illinois who does a lot of work with corn and soybeans, known for his work with the 7 Wonders of Corn and now with the 6 Secrets of Soybean Success. And Fred will be sharing some of his results from that experiment he's been running around, conducting around Illinois this year. Fred's an agronomist and a crop physiologist at the University of Illinois. Just a few points about the webinar this morning. Was going to last approximately 1 hour. So Fred will kick off and he will run through his presentation, towards 50 minutes. We'll be wrapping up and we'll be taking questions. So you can click on the chat icon there at the bottom. You can submit questions. And at the end of the webinar, we'll address these things. There's a lot of questions. We might probably just compile some of those. And we do have your questions and email addresses. And I would ask Fred just to answer them separately and even mail them back to him. There is one CEU available and for this webinar participation. And we'll kind of review that at the end of the session here in 1 hour. So again, welcome to the webinar. And Fred, thank you very much for presenting today, and you can take on.
Well, thank you, Dan. Hey, everybody, thanks for joining us today on this webinar. Before I forget about it, if you look at the authors on my title slide, I acknowledge some of my graduate students. So these are the kids that actually do the work. I get to talk to you about it, but kudos to those grad students for playing a pretty big role. Now, one of the reasons that we're interested in increasing soybean yield is that there's a huge gap between what a lot of growers produce and what is possible. I'm going to tell you that the average yield of soybean in the U.S. in a normal year, if there is such a thing, is somewhere in the mid-40s. That guy that in Missouri that does a world record yield is almost 4 times that. So the world record soybean yield is 161. And just this very year, in part of the Illinois Soybean Yield Challenge, there was a grower that produced almost 104 bushels. I believe that's an Illinois record. So I'm here to tell you there's a lot of yield to be gained in soybean with better crop management. And that's one of the things that we're going to try and talk to you about today. Now, I know that if you could win the world record or win the Illinois Challenge, you can kind of gain a little celebrity status, maybe make some endorsements. But I think the way to grow high soybean yields and profitably is what I'm going to call intelligent intensification. So I'm in the education game. The intelligence is allegedly what you're going to get here. And then the intensification is understanding those management factors that each year have the biggest impact on soybean yield and trying to make sure you get those.
It's because right. You do have information.
And that's
so
where
I would say there's good evidence that you do have something to offer, and I'll have to tell you that.
Got a little background confusion there, but that's where the so-called 6 secrets
or careers or anything else that you might think is of this world.
I think whoever the organizer is, we're getting a bleed through here.
Linda, we can hear you speak.
Okay, sorry about that. Threw me off. I was waiting for the questions at the end.
You need to modify your definition here of what's valuable.
And a little glitch there.
So look at the, it's for.
Okay, well, I hope you get. All right, thanks, guys. That was interesting. It's like we're on a party phone line or something. So if I want high soybean yield, I want to know those factors that each year have a big impact on soybean yield and get that right. And that's the so-called 6 secrets of soybean success. This is the flip side to my 7 wonders of the corn yield world. And I'm going to credit the Illinois Soybean Association for helping me come up with this. I mean, a couple of years ago, they came to me and they said, we like that 7 wonders of corn thing, and we wonder if you could come up with a similar concept for soybean yield. And I remember distinctly the phrase they said, we want to make soybean yield sexy. So I thought long and hard about how am I going to make soybean yield sexy. Of course, I spoke to my friend Victoria, and she said if it's going to be sexy, you got to make it secret. So hence the 6 secrets of soybean success. But I don't keep it secret very well because I'm going to tell them all to you. Now, and those are my 6 factors that have the biggest impact on soybean yield. Now, before I get into the soybean secrets, there are some good things about soybean that are not soybean secrets, but they have to do with if you grow soybean as the crop before your corn crop, which is, I know, a reason a lot of you actually grow soybean. So you know if soybean was the previous crop to your corn crop, your next corn crop yields on average 25 bushels better, and it needs less nitrogen fertilizer, the so-called soybean nitrogen credit. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but one of the advantages of soybean as a previous crop to corn is your corn crop's better and needs less N. So this isn't a soybean secret, but it's certainly an advantage of soybean. Another advantage of soybean compared to corn is that soybean improves the tilth of the soil, and it has to do with a difference in root system. Corn is a taproot, whereas soybean is a corn is a fibrous root, whereas soybean is a taproot. And it's taproots that naturally fracture soil compaction. I mean, think about the tillage radish, right? That's the ultimate taproot. You grow that thing, you don't even have to till. But, and I won't say soybean is as big a taproot as the tillage radish, but if you have 140,000 of them out there, you can fracture a little soil compaction. So soybean compared to corn improves the tilth of the soil. And anybody who's ever chisel plowed corn or soybean stubble, man, you know those crops work up differently. I show you here one day after a fall chisel plow where soybean was the previous crop. This is next to third-year corn residue. You know, and talk about a difference in soil tilth. I mean, on the soybean side, I refer to this as mellow. I mean, look at that. I could skip across there in my bare feet. But when I got over on the corn side, I might sprain my ankle, fall down, and I gouge my eye out on a piece of stalk residue. The difference is the rooting. I mean, which one of these situations do you think would be better for your next year's corn crop? So these aren't soybean secrets, but they are certainly benefits if you grow soybean as the previous crop to your corn. Now, before I get into each of the soybean secrets, there's a sad fact of life which is called a prerequisite. And a prerequisite is what you have to have or do before you can have or do what you want to do. I mean, in my world, you know, there's a lot of prerequisites. You want to send your son or daughter to a fantastic school like the University of Illinois, they need certain prerequisites. They have to have that good high school degree, you know, good grades, good test scores. You have to have a lot of money. I mean, those are the prerequisites, and there's some key prerequisites to the secrets. And I don't mean they're not important. They're actually crucial. But either in and of themselves they don't add yield or they don't necessarily have to be done every year. You know, our state would be mostly a swamp if it wasn't for tile drainage. And you know how soybean hates having wet feet. And I recently learned from the tile guy that now I need a new tile between all my other tiles. My gosh, is that expensive, but am I happy when it's done? Oh boy, weeds don't add yield. Rather not have any weeds. And I'll tell you, weed control in soybean is really underrated. Remember the days when we would let the weeds grow up good and tall, and come out and hit them once with glyphosate, and then we'd harvest a clean field at the end? How fantastic that felt, harvesting our 40 bushels on a clean field. And I wonder how much yield we gave up by not controlling those weeds. So underrated weed control in soybean. Now we have resistant weeds, which makes it even harder. And then finally, a key prerequisite for soybean is to have the proper soil pH. The reason that you lime the soil is primarily for the soybean. Soybean's pretty finicky about the soil pH it likes. You know, is it too low? Soybean's not happy. Is it too high? The soybean's not happy. Soybean wants it just right. Not too low, not too high, just right. I call that the Goldilocks rule. So these are the key prerequisites. And then, you know, what are the 6 factors, the 6 secrets that each year can impact soybean yield? I'm going to go through each one of these. I'll show you a little data to justify each one, and then I'll show you how knowing this allows us to put together a package, a systems approach on our quest to increase soybean yield. In case you haven't heard this, I'll let you sort of play or guess along. And I'm going to start at the top of the list. And you already know the factor that has the biggest impact on your soybean yield. It's the one you typically have the least control over, the weather, Mother Nature. So here's the good news when it comes to weather. When any of my grand agronomic schemes don't work, which sadly is fairly often, I just blame the weather. It's often correct. And here's where I like to make a kind of a smug recommendation for high soybean yield, and it goes like this. Plant early. Well, I am convinced that you need to plant soybean earlier. The soybean planting date is determined by the weather. If the weather's not in the mood, there's no way you can plant. And it's the weather after you plant that dictates the success of that planting date. And as much as I'd like to see a plant earlier, it's not under your control. It's determined by the weather. So early planting is not one of the 6 secrets of soybean success. And I'll tell you, I was painfully reminded about that back in 2013, 2 years ago, when excess precipitation in April delayed my soybean planting. So here you see our fine state here, the land of Lincoln, and you'll notice here that 2013, maybe you'll remember this, that we had a lot more precipitation than normal in 2013. In fact, some of the state had record wettest, and this delayed our planting. I didn't put a seed in the ground until the 16th of May, 2013. I blame the weather. Now, you know what you do if the weather's not working for you? Then you refer to the weather using that pregnant dog term. You say, this weather is a real pregnant dog. Remember 2012? Talk about a pregnant dog weather year. An awful lot of the corn and soybean belt was mirrored in drought. If you look at our state in Illinois, look, our entire state in Illinois had drought in 2012. Well, except right up here in the northeast part where they don't actually grow any crops. But the whole state had drought. And in fact, until 2012, I did not know there was such a thing as exceptional drought. Usually when I use the word exceptional, it refers to something pretty good. But not when it comes to drought, I'll tell you. Talk about a pregnant dog weather year. And the adage is, if you don't like the weather, just wait, it'll change. 2014 was a lot better weather year for crop production, but it wasn't perfect. And if I had to look at my main weather nemesis in 2014, it was too much rain in June. So again, I'm showing you here based on the color, the percentage of normal precipitation in June. And this blue and purple means that it was in some cases more than 200% more precipitation more than normal in June. Since soybean doesn't like to have those wet feet, I looked at a lot of soybeans struggling in early June because of the weather. So weather's the #1 factor that influences soybean yield. What do you suppose the second secret is? I think this one might be a little bit of a surprise to you, and it is your fertility. And the reason that fertility is #2 is, well, there's a couple of reasons. One reason is that unlike corn, you don't have to put nitrogen fertilizer on your soybean, because soybean gets some of its nitrogen from the nodules. So you know how this story goes. Here's the rhizobium nodules, and the plant supplies the nodules with sugars and energy, and in return, the bacterium in these nodules takes some nitrogen out of the atmosphere and supply it to the plant. That's called biological nitrogen fixation. And the key term is some. How much of the nitrogen that soybean needs do you think comes from the nodules? Well, the answer is about half. About 50%, maybe 60% in a good year comes from the nodules. The rest of the nitrogen soybean needs has to come from the soil or the breakdown of the previous corn crop's residue. And soybean is a huge nitrogen-requiring crop. The soybean crop has to accumulate somewhere between 4 and 5 pounds of nitrogen for each bushel. And that nitrogen is going to come from either the nodules or the soil. And so I show you here the accumulation pattern of nitrogen for 60 bushel soybean, showing you how much nitrogen is in that 60 bushel soybean crop, pounds per acre, as a function of time. I've expressed time on growth stage and on days after planting. So in other words, that 60 bushel soybean crop has to accumulate 245 pounds of N from the nodules and the soil. And an awful lot of that N, you'll notice, ends up in the in the seed. That soybean seed has a high concentration of protein. So of the 245 pounds of nitrogen that soybean plant has to accumulate to grow 60 bushels, 179 pounds of it end up in the seed. Now, if I know how much nitrogen the soybean crop has to accumulate, and I know how much ends up in the seed, I can estimate that half of this total comes from nitrogen fixation, or from the nodules, then I can do what's called a nitrogen mass balance. And I've done that here for 60 bushel soybean. So that 60 bushel soybean has to accumulate 245 pounds of N over the course of the season. That's the nodules and the soil. So I'm going to assume half of that comes from the nodules. I simply divided that in two. I know that that 60 bushel soybean crop removes 179 pounds of nitrogen with the grain, and that means that that 60 bushel soybean crop actually removes almost 60 pounds of nitrogen from the soil. Soybean does not add nitrogen to the soil. This is one of these rural legends. Soybean removes more nitrogen from the soil than it fixes. There is no such thing as a soybean nitrogen credit. It's actually a corn residue penalty. I know we used to say that for every bushel of soybean you produced, you got a pound of nitrogen released into the soil. It's exactly the opposite. For every bushel of soybean that you produce, you remove at least a pound of nitrogen from the soil. That's because of the high nitrogen requirement by soybean. And guess what? The higher the yield level, the greater the amount of nitrogen soybean needs has to come from the soil. So I summarized here a whole list of scientific literature in what was called a meta-analysis. What this is showing you here, for different soybean yields, how much nitrogen that crop has to accumulate. That's from either the nodules and the soil. That's in the orange line. So that's how much nitrogen you need to grow different yield levels of soybean. And then the blue line shows you how much of that nitrogen will come from the nodules. What I want you to notice is the higher the yield level, the greater the gap between how much nitrogen the soybean needs and how much the nodules could supply. And a lot of people think that if we don't figure out some way to supplement nitrogen to the soybean crop, about 70 bushels is the top end yield. I'm one of them, and I can tell you we are attempting to look at ways to assess how to get additional nitrogen into the soybean crop with fertilization. That's a subject for a whole another webinar. Well, another reason that fertility is number 2 has to do with the fact that most Illinois farmers are not adequately fertilizing their soybean. And when they are fertilizing their soybean, they're mostly fertilizing it with what I believe is the wrong nutrient. I'm going to show you a quote from an old experiment station bulletin. This is an experiment station bulletin in 1950. This is when soybean production in Illinois is really taken off. And a guy named Hammond wrote in this bulletin, over 60 years ago, from the standpoint of removal, he said, soybeans are hard on the land. And what he meant by that is soybean is a crop that's rapidly going to deplete the soil of bases or its fertility. That would lead you to believe that if you're going to grow soybean, you're going to have to actually fertilize it. But the question is, who fertilizes their soybean? If you take those USDA surveys, 80% of Illinois growers never fertilize their soybean. I'll show you a common fertilization strategy for soybean, well, for corn and soybean in Illinois, and this is what it looks like. What most growers do is they fertilize the corn. So on a corn crop in Illinois, 180 pounds of N would not be uncommon. I mean, 90 pounds of P2O5 would be an average rate of P applied to corn. And while the potassium would vary widely, 100 pounds of K2O would be a reasonable average. Most growers put no sulfur, no micronutrients in the corn. And again, 80% of Illinois growers put no fertilizer whatsoever on soybean. Allegedly, this amount of fertilizer application is enough for the corn and the next year's soybean. Now, if I don't fertilize soybean at all, that would lead me to believe that soybean didn't actually accumulate much nutrients, or I didn't remove much nutrients from the field with the soybean seed. And that would be wrong. I show you here for 6 select nutrients how much of each of these nutrients is required to produce a 60 bushel soybean crop. So this is the amount that the crop has to suck up over the course of the season from either the fertilizer or the soil, or for nitrogen, at least half of it from the nodules. That's what's required to produce. And then I also show you how much of each of these nutrients is physically removed from your field when you harvest the grain. This is the amount that you take off the field with that grain, and you ultimately send that somewhere else. And I'm guessing a lot of these nutrients ultimately somehow end up in China. And this is roughly analogous to fertilizer maintenance requirements. And then I also show you the value that's known as the harvest index. And the harvest index means of the amount that the crop has to take up, what percentage of that nutrient is removed with the grain. Now, I get excited about a nutrient as a limiting factor for high soybean yield if one of two things happens. Either the crop needs a lot of it, like potassium or nitrogen, and second, and more important, that nutrient has a high harvest index. Here's my reasoning. I want to grow a lot of seed. I want a lot of grain. And therefore, those nutrients where most of the uptake ends up in the grain must be the most important ones for high soybean yield. So those nutrients that have a high harvest index must be the most important ones. Based on that criteria, my favorite 3 mineral elements for high soybean yield are nitrogen, phosphate, and sulfur. Now, if I ask most growers what the most important dry fertilizer is for soybean production, they'll tell me it's potassium. And I don't mean that potassium is not important, but I'm here to tell you that it's not the most important. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare phosphate and potassium, 60 bushel soybean with 230 bushel corn. And I want you to remember how most growers are fertilizing. Remember, they're putting 90 pounds, P2O5, on their corn and 100 pounds of K2O. So let's presume that that grower then, from that application, they produce 230 bushel corn, followed by 60 bushel soybean. So what I'm showing you here for phosphate and potassium is how much of each of these nutrients are required to produce 230 bushel corn and 60 bushel soybean, the amount the crop has to take up over the course of the season. I also show you how much of each of these nutrients are removed with the grain. And then by subtraction, I show you how much of each of these nutrients actually remain in the stover. I know a lot of you call the stover trash, but it's hard for me to call that stover trash when it has this level of nutrients in it. Now I want to start with potassium. It is true that potassium is important for soybean production. A 60 bushel soybean crop has to accumulate almost as much potassium as a 230 bushel corn crop, and it actually removes more potassium with the grain than those 230 bushel corn. I think this is what leads to the idea that potassium is the most limiting nutrient because it removes more with corn than corn. But think about how most growers are fertilizing. They put 100 pounds of K2O in their corn. It needs 180, but the good news is it only removes 60. So that means in that stover or that trash, there's 124 pounds of potassium. And that potassium does not occur in any organic form, can be freely leached out of the residue with rain, and that means that 2/3 of the potassium that soybean needs is actually in the corn stover. If you look at how much potassium you remove from the soil with a corn soybean crop, you remove about 125 pounds, put 100 on, it's roughly in balance. I'm going to tell you it's phosphorus, which is usually the most limiting element for soybean production, and it has to do with the way we're fertilizing the corn and not fertilizing the soybean. Remember, I said that 90 pounds P2O5 was the average. 230 bushel corn crop needs 101, so I'm already 10 short. It removes 80 pounds, So that means of the 90 pounds of phosphorus I put on, I only left 10 for the next soybean crop, which, by the way, needs 43, and which removes 35. Over the course of a corn-soybean rotation, I remove 115 pounds of P2O5, only put 90 on, so I mine the soil of 25 pounds. I'm going to say that the way we're fertilizing or not fertilizing, that I believe phosphorus is the most limiting element for soybean production. And I'm going to try and further prove this to you by showing you the uptake pattern of potassium and phosphate. So I'll start with potassium. And it is true that potassium is quite important for soybean production. A 60 bushel soybean crop has to take up 170 pounds of potassium. It has to take up potassium at a rapid rate from about 50 days after planting all the way up to 100 days. So not that it's not important. But look at where most of the potassium is within the soybean plant. It's in the stem and the petiole. More than half of the potassium in soybean is in the stem and the petiole, where it's freely mobile. In fact, all of this potassium that the seed needs can be met by taking it out of the stem or the petiole. I want you to compare this uptake pattern to the uptake pattern of phosphorus. So here's the uptake pattern of phosphorus, and you'll notice compared to potassium is it has a longer period of uptake, from 40 days all the way to 110 days. I'll go back. Unlike potassium, this is potassium, where there's a huge stem reservoir, there is no reservoir of phosphorus in the stem. This huge seed requirement for soybean has to be met by taking it up from the soil. And remember, when you fertilize the corn crop almost 2 years before, and you hope some of that is still available during the grain seed filling of soybean, well, good luck with that. I think this is the fertilizer element that's most limiting soybean production. I'll show you some actual data too here in a minute. But that's why fertility is number 2. Now, what's number 3? And I don't know about you, but I agonize long and hard over what corn hybrid I'm going to grow. And then I turn around and buy any old damn soybean. I don't care. Is it round? Okay. Big mistake. All soybean varieties are not equal. I'll show you 10 varieties here. So varieties number 3. I'll show you 10 varieties here grown at my site in Champaign with high management. And with high management, I presumably remove the other limiting factors, allowing the varietal difference to express themselves. I want you to notice that I ranked the varieties here according to their yield. And they range from 54.5 to 66 bushels. That's an 11.5 bushel yield swing. Boy, 11.5 doesn't sound like very much, but with soybean, it's a lot. Even at $10. So variety, can't overlook it. Way underrated. Number 4. What's number 4? This has to do with the growth habit of soybean. Soybean growth habit is what's known as indeterminate. And indeterminate means that the crop can flower and develop leaves at the same time. So in other words, you can have multiple nodes in soybean that can have pods, and you can have more than one pod at a given node. And a typical soybean plant will have 20 nodes. Guess what? It's the closest leaf that supplies most of the energy for the pods and seeds at that node. Most of the energy that's supplied to these pods come from the closest leaf. And so number 4 then is foliar protection. Protecting that leaf. Keeping it active as long as possible. This is protecting it from diseases, protecting it from insects. If you have some sort of stress relief growth regulator, it'd fit into this category as well. And foliar protection has to do with what the yield components of soybean are. If you look at soybean yield, it's a math equation, multiplying the 3 components together. Soybean yield's a function of pod number per acre. It's not plants per acre because, the thing branches. You can have multiple nodes that have more than one pod. So it's pod number per acre times seeds per pod times weight per seed. And change any one of these, and you can change soybean yield. Now, normally I would tell you the pod number per acre is primarily the weather and the fertility. I would tell you that seeds per pod, that's primarily a genetic trait. I can't tell you how much time I spent, looking for that 5-bean pod when it was worth something. I don't know if any of you have found a 5-bean pod, but my student did. He tried to sell it to me. but I took a picture of it instead. So there it is. There's the 5-bean pod. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, next to a 4-bean pod. That's primarily a genetic trait. And then finally, the weight of each seed within these pods is how long do you keep those leaves active. If you can increase the seed weight 2 milligrams, that's worth a bushel. And that's one of the reasons that foliar protection is so important. Now, if I come back to which one of these yield components is the most important, it's pod number. You know, when you do a soybean yield test, you count the number of pods in a certain area, and the more pods, the better. So pod number is probably the most important one. But I'm here to ask you, where on the soybean plant do you think most of the pods are located? I'll make this into a multiple choice question. You know, are they at the bottom of the plant, the middle of the plant, the top of the plant? Are they on the branches, or are they evenly distributed throughout the plant? Those are your 5 choices. Bottom, middle, top, equal, or branches. Where are most of the pods on the soybean plant? Well, I know where most of the pods on the soybean plant are because, you know, we have grad students. You could send a grad student out there to count them. I mean, you can squeeze a lot of juice out of a grad student before you give them their degree. And the answer is most of the pods on the soybean plant are in the middle. What I show you here is this is a pod number per node, with 0 being the bottom of the plant, 20 being the top of the plant. I've removed the branches. Branches are down here at the bottom. The branches are overrated. Only about 15% of the yield comes from the branches. 60% of the soybean yield comes from the middle, from nodes 7 through 13. That's where 60% of this 50 bushel soybean yield comes from. Now this is 50 bushel soybean. What do you suppose 62 bushel soybean looks like? Well, it looks like that. Notice it's still the middle, which is the most important area. Get a few more pods at the bottom, a few more pods at the top. It's the middle part of the plant, which is the most important. Now, by the way, 62 bushel soybean is 12 bushels more than 50, and it's only 6 more pods. You can put 1 more pod on the soybean plant, that's worth 2 bushels. And so that's one of the reasons that foliar protection is so important, particularly protecting those leaves at nodes 7 through 13, where 60% of the yield comes from. Now, number 5 has to do with all the fantastic stuff that you can put on the seed. And that is seed treatment. This would include your inoculum. And if you haven't grown soybean in a field for a long time, seed inoculum is a good insurance. This could also include, you know, your growth regulator, your micronutrient. But the seed treatment that I'm going to talk about is protecting that seed from diseases, insects, or nematodes from pests. And you know what you call a soybean seed that has no seed treatment? An untreated soybean seed is called naked seed. I love the sound of that. Naked sounds pretty sexy, but I hate the result of naked seed. When I compare a naked seed to a fully treated seed, I want you to see that they don't emerge as well. And not only do they not emerge as well, but they don't grow as rapidly. Again, here's another graduate student exercise. You can send them out to count how much better the treated seed emerge over the naked seed. That's about 5 to 10,000 more plants per acre. 5 to 10,000 more plants per acre, you realize, from treated seed. Doesn't sound like much, but you know, at the cost of soybean seed these days, it's a pretty good advantage. So not only do more seeds emerge, but they also grow better after emergence. And this is especially true if you plant early. And I tell you, we can see this effect, as late as the first week of July, all the way up to the R2 growth stage. So here's a comparison of a minimal seed treatment. This is fungicide only, so it's not naked seed, but I suppose I'd call that scantily clad. And then here's the completely clothed seed treatment, the fungicide, insecticide, nematicide. And I think you can tell which one of these has the more robust growth. The greener, they're taller. So seed treatment. I mean, I'm telling you, we can see this effect right to the row. Here's the minimal seed treatment. Here's the complete seed treatment. This is an expensive scientific instrument called a rulerometer that we use to actually quantify this difference in growth. And then finally, number 6 is row arrangement. Narrow rows, wide rows. Now, the advantage of a narrow row is it intercepts light faster. The disadvantage of a narrow row is there's less air movement down the row, which can lead to certain leaf diseases, particularly white mold. Now, long story short, I believe the future of corn is ultimately 20-inch rows. So my idea of a narrow row in soybean is 20-inch row. I know you could do 15s. It's the same thing, but I try and look down the road. I think in the future we'll be planting corn in 20-inch rows. We use the same planter to plant soybean in 20-inch rows. And I think a 20-inch row is the compromise between greater light interception, but maybe a little bit more air movement down that canopy. Now then, based on these 6 secrets, we came up with our high-tech system, which I show you here in blue, and we compared it to a grower standard. And I'm going to summarize first the work we did in 2012 and 13, and then I'll show you how we tweaked this in what we found in this last year, 2014. So again, on the high-tech side, we're in 20-inch rows versus 30-inch rows. The high-tech side is a complete seed treatment versus either naked seed or a minimal seed treatment. The high-tech side had a fungicide or insecticide in 2012 and 13. We looked at each separately and the combination compared to no foliar treatment. You know, I tend to think if you're going to put a lot of management at it and you're going to plant early, you might as well make full use of the season. So my belief is that a full maturity, the fullest maturity for the region is probably the way to go, but we tested both a normal and a full maturity, both high and standard tech. And then we, in one case, we actually fertilized the soybean. On the standard side, we fertilized a year before the corn, or we fertilized the soybean. We used a premium fertilizer, Micro Essentials. This supplies phosphorus, sulfur, and zinc all in the same granule. We use 75 pounds P2O5. Not saying that's the amount you need, but that's how much phosphate we think a 100-bushel soybean crop has to accumulate. We have a toolbar, and we banded it right under the row just for to try and get the maximum benefit. Again, it's not a recommendation. It's designed to show you the biological capability to increase soybean yield with crop management. In 2012 and 13, we had 14 trials in our fair state. So here's where our research sites were. We varied the maturity according to where you were in the state. We used half of these trials had Asgrow seed, BSF protection. The other half had Syngenta seed, Syngenta protection. We had a full and maturity one in each. We had them in 20 and 30-inch rows. And we used a compromise seeding rate of 160,000 plants per acre. Probably a little on the high side, but we'd rather err high than low. Normally, I tell you, if you're planting early, you can get away with less, so they don't get leggy. If you're planting late, you got to plant more, so they intercept light faster. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you, since 2012 and 2013 were so different, I will show you each of these years, at least the difference between the standard and the high-tech separately first. So what I show you here is the standard yield for each of these sites. There's the high-tech yield. And then this diamond here is the scientific symbol. That means I subtracted the standard from the high-tech. I mean, you can check my math. You'll notice that there's a wide range in yield among the standard. I mean, from about 38 bushels to 66. But in 2012, at every site, that high-tech management out-yielded the standard anywhere from 7.5 to 12 bushels, or almost 10 bushels on average. Again, 10 bushels doesn't sound like much when I'm used to thinking about corn, but it's pretty good yield increase when it comes to soybean. Now I'll show you the same comparison in 2013. 2013 was a much better weather year for soybean. You'll notice the standard yields are quite a bit higher. But even in 2013, at 7 of the 8 sites, there was a measurable increase in yield from the high-tech package over the standard. In some cases, it was fairly large. Overall, it was a little over 6 bushels. So if I average these 2 years together, that's an 8.2 bushel yield increase from the high-tech package over the standard. And the question is, which one of these factors or factors is largely responsible for that yield increase? I'll tell you, that's a very difficult question to answer since all of these factors are mixed together. And so in order to answer the question, which one of these factors has the biggest impact, we use what's known as an omission plot design. And the omission plot design allows us to compare the high-tech package, that's everything, that's in blue, with the standard package, that's in orange. And then what we do, one factor at a time, is we replace the high-tech factor with the standard. So see, we replace the orange one with the standard, and we look at the loss in yield from omitting that factor from the high-tech package, hence the name omission design. We do that for all factors. But at the same time, we add one high-tech factor to the traditional, and we look at the increase in yield from doing one thing. We do that to all factors. This would be like standard agronomy if you were doing side-by-side comparisons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to average the 2 years together, and I'm going to tell you that the variety did make a difference, but the difference depended on the year. In 2012, when we planted early, the fullest maturity for the variety for the region was almost 4 bushels more than normal. But in 2013, when our planting was delayed due to a wet April, then that didn't really make any difference if it was a full or a standard maturity for the region. So for the rest of the data I show you, I'll average the two varieties together. So what I'm going to show you first is this side of the curve. If you're only going to do one of these things, on average, which one gave you the highest yield? So that's what you're looking at here. So again, I've averaged all these trials together. Try and make this a little simpler. And on average, that standard yield was almost 59 bushels. Now you're looking at the effect of adding one factor and only one. In other words, we added that extra fertility. It was worth 3.6 bushels. That was the #1 player alone that increased soybean yield. If we added the fungicide at the R2 growth stage, remember that's the R3 growth stage, that's the stage where you would try and protect leaves 7 through 13, the most important leaves. If we added the fungicide, we gained 1.8. If we added the insecticide, we gained 1.6. We'll put the two together. They don't quite add up, but they're close. So a fungicide insecticide was #2. It was worth 3 bushels. That seed treatment, oh man, it looked good out of the ground. Still worth 1.5 bushels in increase in yield. And narrow rows versus 30 rows really didn't matter in 2012 or 2013. It was only worth 1 bushel. Now I'm going to show you this side of the curve. I'll show you what happens if you omit one of the factors from the high-tech. So here's the high-tech package. Again, 8.2 bushels higher. And now you're looking at what happens if you leave one of those out. In other words, don't have the extra fertility, still have everything else, lose 3 bushels. Don't have the fungicide or insecticide, lose another 3 bushels. If you only had the base seed treatment of the high-tech package, boy, you lost 2.6. And if you had a high-tech package and you only had a 30-inch row, you lost another 2.5. So I summarize these things here for you to show you that there was a lot of individual things you could do to increase soybean yield on the standard side. Better fertility, foliar protection. On the high-tech side, if you omitted these factors, notice how you lost that yield. And notice that the value of things like the seed treatment and the narrow rows are more important on the high-tech side. In other words, omitting these factors gave a greater loss in yield than adding them alone to the standard. Now, very briefly go on to what we did in 2014. So in 2014, we wanted to take a stronger look at fertility, and particularly we wanted to look at the impact of adding potassium. So we added potassium. We actually used a premium potassium fertilizer. This is potassium that was also coated with boron. It's called Aspire, another Mosaic product. We still had the phosphate. We banned the phosphate. You can't ban the potassium without damaging the seed. So we broadcast that. And then we also looked at a combination of potassium and phosphate. And again, we did that along with the foliar protection, the seed treatment, and the narrow row spacing. Just like I showed you in 2013, we had 6 trials in 2014. We went north to south with our trials. Half of them had Monsanto seed, half of them had Syngenta seed, had a full and normal maturity in each trial, 20 and 30-inch rows. They all had the banded phosphate or the broadcast potassium. And I'm here to tell you that 2014 we had some very good soybean yields. So I'll show you here the 6 sites that we had in 2014. There's the standard yields, pretty decent yields. I mean, every one of them over 60 bushels. Here's the high-tech yield. There's the difference in yield that we achieved from the high-tech management. And at 5 of the 6 sites, we got a measurable increase in yield from high-tech management. And at some of the sites, particularly Champaign, that yield increase was enormous. I mean, we almost hit the 100 bushel value here in Champaign with high-tech management, where by managing the soybean, we could increase it by, geez, almost over 20 bushels. Even that on average. The high-tech on average yielded almost 11 bushels more than the standard. And then the question is, which one of these factors was largely responsible in 2014? And again, I'll show you that using the omission plot design. So now I'm showing you the standard system, averaged over all 6 trials. There's the standard yield. When we added that extra phosphorus, we gained 2.3 bushels. When we added the extra potassium, we didn't actually get an increase in yield. And if anything, it went down a little bit. And I think this bolsters our idea that it's phosphorus more than potassium that is the main limiting factor for soybean in a lot of Illinois soils. When we had phosphorus and potassium both, we got a little bit more than the phosphorus alone. Maybe the potassium helps the plant use phosphorus. I'm not sure. When we had the insecticide and the fungicide, we gained almost 2. Not a huge value of the seed treatment. In 14, every year is different, but what we did see in 14 was a pretty decent value of the narrower row spacing. That was worth 3.3. See how each year differs? But fertility, phosphate fertility, is one of the consistent factors we've seen over the last 3 years. Now I'll show you the high-tech side. Again, at 10.8 bushels higher. And now remember, we're looking at omitting one of these factors. So if we left the phosphorus out, we lost 5.4. If we left the potassium out, it didn't really matter. If we left both of them out, it's almost the same thing as leaving the phosphate out. If we didn't foliar protect the high-tech package, we lost 3 bushels. If a little bit greater, almost a bushel loss with the base seed treatment in the high-tech package. And if we had 30-inch rows under a high-tech package with all that management, look, we lost a whopping 7 bushels. So I show you this here. I summarize these here to show you that in 2014, what we noticed was that the cost of omitting the factor from the high-tech package was greater than the gain of including it alone. I mean, the good news is there's a lot of individual things we could have done to increase soybean yield. Narrower row arrangement, better fertility, foliar protection. See how the value of each of these factors on the high-tech side, the cost of omitting it is greater than the gain alone. Apparently they do at least add up, and they more than add up to when you use more than one of these factors individually. So I kind of summarized here a little bit of what our strategies have shown for high-yield soybean. I mean, you've got to have the prerequisites: good drainage, good weed control, got to have the right pH. That's the foundation. And then you got to have good base fertility. I'm not convinced we're adequately fertilizing soybean when we fertilize the corn. I would tell you, at the very least, if you can, divide your application on corn. Put some of it on to soybean. I think if you can, you need to plant early. I think you need to take the advantage of the season to do so. I mean, gosh, that one doesn't actually cost you anymore. When it works, we've seen an almost 4 bushel yield increase. It's those leaves at 7 through 13 in the middle of the plant. Those are the ones that give you the increase in yield. Worth almost 4 bushels. Seed treatment, still valuable. Narrow row spacing. So I'm going to tell you, you can increase soybean yield with crop management. Fertility is particularly important, especially phosphate. 60% of the yield comes from nodes 7 through 13. So, boy, those are the ones that are important to protect. And that is exactly what you would protect with a R3 application. And every one of these secrets can independently increase soybean yield. When they're combined into a system, they're at least additive. I want to thank the students in my laboratory, my undergrads, technician students. These are the ones that have done this work. I want to thank some of my farm cooperators. I use university land at Champaign, but I rent land from farm cooperators at the outlying sites. Couldn't do it without their excellent help. Thank you very much. I want to thank the companies that have supported this research. These are the companies that have in some way given us product, machinery, financial support, better yet, all three. And I especially want to thank the Illinois Soybean Association for hosting this webinar and for your checkoff support of the 6 Secrets concept. I hope you find it valuable. And then I show you my laboratory website here that at least some of this information is on. Woefully, we don't have this year's data on the website yet, but we're working on it. That's the web address. That's what you could Google. So I really do appreciate your attention today. I saved a little time, and I'm anxious to attempt to answer your questions. Do I have to share the screen if you're off the screen? No. Dan, do we have any questions?
Hi, Fred.
Hi, yes.
This is Holly, and I'm going to ask you a question here. If seed treatments were excluded altogether, would you still get the other factors to respond the same?
So what, Holly, what you noticed when we had the high-tech package, the value of the seed treatment was greater as part of the systems approach than it was if you added it alone. So, obviously if you have a well-fertilized crop and you're protecting it, the value of having that plant, be protected through its whole life is magnified. So, I think seed treatment is an easy and cheap insurance, actually, and I think it's something growers should seriously consider.
Okay. Hey, Fred, I'm back online. This is Dan.
Dan.
Yes, somehow when I went to take my phone off mute, I disconnected. Hey, Holly, how many questions have you went through? Just one?
We just started, Dan.
Okay, let me just run through these quick, keep kind of track of our time, talk about treat treatments. He asked, one of the questions was, how do you think sudden death played an impact on soybean yield? Largely the question was, what percentage of yield do you lose from sudden death?
Well, that's a tough question, and it seems to be heavily environmentally dependent. Particularly if you plant early and it's cold and wet, that's when the fungus has infected that seedling. So it's been infected the whole time, and of course the sudden part is when it actually shows up. And so I saw a fair amount of sudden death. It's not an easy thing to research, I'll tell you, because it kind of happenstancely over and along the field. And when you see it, it's devastating. So I can't put a percentage to it. Seed treatment might help a little bit. Making sure that it's not too cold and wet when you plant might help a little bit. That's all I can tell you.
Okay. Next question then. In your experience, how are you seeing gibberellic acid used in soybean production to enhance yield components?
So that's not currently one of the 6 secrets. These are the things we sort of look at on the side. And the gibberellic acid, would fall into the foliar protection category. That's one of these plant growth regulator treatments that may allow me to set an extra pod or somehow change the morphology of the pod. I don't have a lot of solid data on that I could recommend or tell growers when and how to use it. I would caution them that it's a lot easier to decrease yield with one of these treatments than it is to increase it. So there's no recommendation yet I could make that I would consistently say to try it.
Well, you had said one pod, an extra pod per plant is worth about 2 bushels an acre, correct?
That is correct. Yep.
So adding on an extra pod or keeping them, that's actually worth quite a bit. A couple, 2 pods, 4 bushels, it can really add up fast.
Seems easy, doesn't it, Dan? And it seems like the top of the plant might be the target for trying to increase yield. And I'll tell you, in those plots where we had 95 bushels, they had pods at the top of the plant. And if I'm going to go out to a grower's field and I'm going to try and assess the value of a management practice they did, I'm going to look at the top. So this is sort of my indicator. If I did something and set more pods at the top, I'm pretty happy about it. I think there's a lot of potential there. Seems easier than it is.
Another question, talking with progressive soybean growers, how long should they continue to spray into and through the reproductive stages of growth?
Yeah, I know a lot of growers that really want to push yield, put on more than one foliar application. So a lot of growers would start early. They'd do it at R2. They might hit it again at R3. Some of them even going to go as late as R5. I'm only doing it once. I would tell you the one time to do it would be R3 because primarily you're protecting leaves 7 through 13, and you got to be a little careful of spraying the plant. You could damage the crop, and you shouldn't be just putting sprays out for no reason. So right now I'd advocate one spray, but maybe 2 if you really had an insect or a disease issue.
One of the questions you had talked earlier, and why isn't, and you had said this, why again isn't early planting an important secret?
It is important, but it's not under your control. It's determined by the weather. It's the weather that determines when you can plant. Much as I want to get out and plant it'll be the first week of April, if the weather's not in the mood, I have no hope of doing it. And sometimes I think you could make your situation worse by planting too early. Again, cold, wet leads to sudden death, leads to poor emergence. So while for the most part I think there's yield to be gained in soybean by earlier planting, it's not a secret because it's not completely under my control.
One of the questions that was asked was last June soybeans sort of were yellow and they were kind of yellow dual general melees. It had some wet feet. And what was that doing to nitrogen fixation?
So I showed the June weather, and it was wet in June, and that soybean crop just sat there and looked terrible. I could tell you everywhere that water sat, and if you pulled up those plants that had that malaise, little yellow color, well, they didn't have enough nodules on them, so the nodules got off to a slow start. Now ultimately, some of those crops surprised me for how well they came out of it. I think they lost some yield, but I think the soybean plant forgave us a little bit. Most of the yield's made in August. So, but those yellow ones clearly didn't have the nodules on them. The nodules need oxygen to grow. And if they're waterlogged or have wet feet, they won't nodulate as well. And I think you were looking at a combination of not enough soil-supplied nitrogen and not enough oxygen to the root.
One last question before we wrap up. You showed all these, through the emission plots, you showed these yield responses. The question is, if you excluded the seed treatments altogether, would all the other factors respond as well as they did?
Yeah, we tried to address that question, and the seed treatment is going to be somewhat geographic and weather dependent. I know we're hearing that some noise about how insecticide seed treatments aren't necessary on soybean, but I see a pretty decent increase in growth, and in some years I'm seeing yield increases that are in the 2 or 3 bushel range. So when the other factors are present, when it's well fertilized, when you have early planting, when you have narrow rows, when you're going to finish it off with a foliar protection, then the value of the seed treatment is actually greater, not less.
Okay. Well, we want to wrap this up right at 11:30. Fred, I want to first thank you very much for doing a great presentation about soybeans. Very, very interesting. For those in attendance, if you want one CEU for today, you see on the slide, just email Ann Hurak at Charleston Norwick. Your name is your CCA number, and she will file that away. The webinar will be available at Hillside, so you can listen to it again. You can also see the slides. That will be up in a couple days. And if you come back and view the webinar later and you want your one CEU, you can self-report that through the CCA website when you log in. Again, on behalf of the Illinois Soybean Association, first, Fred, I want to thank you for taking the time, and thank everyone for participating today. And don't hesitate to send some emails to Fred if you got some further questions. So we're all done. Thank you, Fred. So we're all done for the day. Thank you all.